What a lovely introduction. Nice to meet you all. I'm normally in London, so it's nice to actually see developers in another part of the country. I am also going to preface this talk of I have tried to line it up in a way that is helpful regardless of what size you're currently at. So I do think they're quite helpful tips just regardless. But also, I hope that none of this stresses anybody out. Just take a deep breath. I'm going to talk about a lot of different options for things, but as always with game development, it very much depends on your specific title and what that needs and what your team is like and all sorts of other things. So this is by no means, cemented. It's just some considerations to think about as your game starts to grow and what kind of marketing considerations might happen. So we'll be talking about who the hell I am and why I'm sitting on this stage. The marketing mix you might have starting out as an indie, and then kind of common growth challenges that I've seen throughout the different games that I've worked on, as well as the considerations I just mentioned that are hopefully helpful to just kind of get your brain bubbling into what might come up as you grow. Rehash at the end, and then of course any questions. So in regards to who I am, I've been in games marketing for over 10 years now, which makes me feel approximately 1,000 years old when I talk to new people who've joined the industry. I often go by brand sorceress because marketing often makes people cringe, and this is just a bit more fun. And in my spare time, I go to fantasy balls and I dress like an elf, so why not? In regards to my kind of career history, I have done a nice little mix of things. I started out at a tiny indie agency that did indie marketing that has now crumbled to dust, and you will have never heard of it. But I got to work on over 40 games as my first ever job, so that was great because they were all different genres, platforms, monetization, etc. But then, working with agencies, nobody wants to work with marketing after they've launched the game, and I was really sad every time the devs said goodbye. So I was like, I'd love to work in-house somewhere. So then I went to a place called Fail Better Games, who are known for their narrative stuff, and got to work in-house and learn all about community management and what happens after launch, which was very nice. And that was also during their growth period too, because they were trying to bring a 10-year game onto new platforms, and there was all sorts of exciting stuff going on. And then I was like, this is also great, but I would love to know how to do marketing when you have a budget. That would be cool. And at that time, thankfully, Mediatonic were hiring their first ever marketing person, and I managed to snag that job. So got to work with them first marketing the studio itself back in 2019 because they knew that they wanted to start making their own games. And then they had a game called Fall Guys that was coming up. So then quickly started to jump onto the marketing for Fall Guys because there were just never enough hands on deck to get all that kind of stuff done. So for the past 4 to 5 years, have been working at Mediatonic and then Epic when we were acquired on Fall Guys as their brand director. But like anything in dev, have worn lots of hats on the publishing side to get everything done. And unfortunately it was part of the layoff, so I'm now contracting if you need anybody. But I'm very happy to chat about some of the things I learned through this growth period. So the first premise is that you are an indie dev, you're making a cool game. Your priorities are probably things like the game is good, it works, and people know it exists. Fingers crossed, right? Those are kind of the top 3 priorities at this stage. And you might be looking at a marketing mix like this, hopefully a mailing list, a cool Steam page, you've got maybe 1 or 2 social media channels, and everything's probably in one language unless you're really savvy and full of resources and you can do localization at this point. But then, premise number 2, by the luck of some elder god, marketing alignment, stars aligning, all that kind of stuff, your game and your hard work has really paid off and it becomes big. So now you have slightly different priorities. You probably still have those other priorities, but now they're also player expectations, the consumer journey. I'm sorry, all this might sound very corporate compared to all the other people I've talked today. And also, extended visibility. And suddenly your marketing mix may look like this. So you might need, more social media platforms, blogs in multiple languages, websites in multiple languages, an increased Discord presence, presence rather, and things like that. So suddenly there's all sorts of extra things that you have to think about. And these are kind of the common things that I have found through different games' growth spurts. So one, you just have less bandwidth. It's always a problem. We're always stretched really thin, but somehow it gets worse. Secondly, there's more expected of you. We all know, players can be a bit particular about things. Some things surprising and other things not so surprising. And then also you're growing your growth, or at least trying to retain it. And obviously this could vary wildly depending on whether or not you're like a live service game, or you have like updates and DLC, or it's just out there, but you kind of need to like keep making some money while you're working on your next game. So in regards to recommended considerations, I would recommend paying attention to things like your values, your audience, scalability, which is probably the most ridiculous marketing term in here, I'm sorry, and the most sexy of all, resource management, which I've put Asterion next to because just to make it like the sexier one on this post. And then, prefacing, all these things are always good to pay attention to, but I think they're really important when you start to grow and you have that lower bandwidth. So in regards to digging into values, you probably feel like this already. I certainly do. But definitely once your game goes big, like you just are monsooned with all sorts of opportunities and, options for you to explore. And, imagine when you have a 10 out of 10 on your hands, like there's probably people that want to talk about partnerships and IP. There's people that want to interview you or get you involved in events, and it just never stops. So when you're inundated with all of this, would recommend taking a look at a few things like brand, objectives, and analytics. So, for example, with brand, basically these things help you define what you can say yes or no to. They're your boundaries. You're going to be asked a lot of questions. You're going to be given a lot of opportunities. How to you quickly answer that? So when it comes to brand, what are the pillars of your game? Those could be design pillars, marketing pillars, the community pillars. Basically build a whole temple, just make sure that you know the in and out of your brand. Do you have brand guidelines, both for internal people, because your team might also be growing, and for external people who might want to work with your IP? Because eventually, you're just going to be bombarded with people asking you questions about if you could do certain things in game or with your characters. So it's just easier to create a brand guideline so that they don't bother you for that. And also values not just for your game, but your studio. Like, what is your mission? Who are you? Who are you not? What are you going to say no to? All that kind of stuff. Basically, what you will not do is almost more important than anything else. With regards to objectives, once again, that's just how can I say yes or no faster? So what are you trying to achieve? Is it fit for purpose? Is it precise? Is it measurable? How can you make sure that you're using your bandwidth appropriately and not burning yourself out? And how do you make sure that your objectives are also known throughout your team so that everybody's kind of working in the same direction and you don't end up with two different people working in opposite directions and causing chaos down the line later. And then analytics, not exactly, once again, the most sexy part, but still very important. Nobody wants to be sitting in endless meetings about KPIs. Make sure that they are objectives that are going to be good for you, that can be measured by those analytics. Make your own objectives and look at the things that are actually going to be helpful to what you're measuring. Don't just feel like you have to look at every piece of data that social media or anything else spits out at you, because it's very easy to get lost into that. And secondly, audience. So this is about player expectation. So before, visibility was a bit of your main concern, but now the player expectations are super amplified. So now it's a bit more about that consumer journey. So what are the touch points and how are people interacting with your game from both when they hear about it to when they buy the game, and then also that first, actually development part of when they're in the game and they start playing. Is that as smooth as it could be? Are there any kind of gaps that you need to address, or any confusing spots where people aren't engaging with your game, as well as things like player support. Especially if it's a live game, people might need to get in touch about like bugs or feedback. Are there clear places where people can get in touch with you so that they're going through that port of contact instead of just blasting everybody that works for you on social? How do you make this easier on your team? And also, who's managing this? Is it your team? Is it somebody on your team? Is it an outsourced thing or something that your publisher helps you out with? All that kind of stuff. And also value to your player. Like, is the price point right? Do they feel like their time is being spent well? All that kind of point. And community. So hopefully you've started a bit of this at the beginning, but like, do you have community guidelines? Do you have mods, or do you have people on the team that can come in and make sure that the community is growing healthily and being nurtured and not becoming toxic? Those are all super important. And then a final note about parity. So if you're porting to different platforms and your game is going to be spread across, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, etc., are you being equal in your opportunities to them, both from a legal sense, but for the players that might exist on each of those platforms, because they do require slightly different marketing and communications. And, you don't want to miss out on one just because you're wholly focused on another. And that's also where some of like legal concerns come into place when you're big, particularly if there's like contracts with IP partners and things like that too. And then scalability. So, are you working smarter instead of harder? Are there ways that you can make the small acts that you do have a really big impact? From a comm standpoint, this could be things like, do you have the capacity to speak globally? Are you looking into additional markets that you could explore if you've kind of already, exhausted like the US and European market, for example? This could be both things like localization, but also culturalization, because maybe there's a really cool part of your game that hits really big with Brazil, and you've not had the opportunity to kind of engage with that audience yet and see how they like to engage with the game too. Are there more social media avenues you could explore? Are there communication channels on the different platforms you're on? How do you kind of get this all working, to the best that it can be for you with minimal effort? Messaging also changes. It's a very careful balancing act of, you want to be as clear as possible and you want to try to reach the most broad audience as possible at this stage, but at the same time you really want to create and keep that special sauce for your game and your tone of voice and the thing that makes your brand really stand out compared to your competitors. For example, like working on Fall Guys, our tone of voice is super important. There's certain branded terminology words, for example, like we used rounds instead of levels. When are you using that type of brand terminology in your communications instead of wider player communications where you can kind of maybe just say levels instead because they're people who've never interacted with your game before and you don't want to confuse them. So it's all about that kind of like push and pull and balancing that fine line. As well as consistency too. Like a lot of devs that I've worked with have set themselves up to fail because they will start really heavily on a super quick communication consistency level, but then can't keep it up later. So can you come up with a system that's going to allow you to chat to your players regularly enough, but not enough that you feel like, oh my God, we have to release another blog this month and I just don't have the time and the energy to do so. And this comes into creativity as well, because it's wild how many different types of platforms you have to start thinking about in regards to like what channel your trailers are going on, and if you're doing things on TikTok and that's a vertical versus trailers are obviously normally landscape. So how do you come up with the whole trailer that's going to fit on both of those things, and is it even going to be right for both of those audiences? But at this kind of scale, you really want to be able to trim and reuse things as much as possible so that it's just easier for you. And then finally, resource management. I do think this one gets overlooked a lot, which is fair because I also like to think about all the cool stuff that gets put out, when games are successful, but infrastructure is important. So this could be data. So are there things within the game or within the marketing tools that you use that you can set up to get those very specific data points that you need to know that you're doing a good job. Make it matter to you and your team so that you can sit down and look at it regularly without it becoming a 2-hour meeting. And to make sure that everybody is getting those learnings at the same time as well, so that every part of your team can work effectively. Definitely don't just do it for the sake of looking at numbers, because that's boring and nobody wants that. And then also, how can you automate things or make processes and systems so that there's not like a resource drain because only one person knows how to do the one thing, or there's like somebody who is just going the long way around doing something that could be really simple, and they could spend their time doing something creative and fun instead of having to answer personally 1 billion, I don't know, tickets by hand or something like that. Obviously, you still want to be able to pay attention to those things, but anything that you can do to make it a bit more efficient is great. And I think the most forgotten part about this is the people management side of things. It's very hard when things are growing really fast. Everybody's very excited. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. A lot of games companies, especially, to be fair, like at any size, I've never seen it really change, whether it's at a larger company or an indie company, has people management training or think about things in a kind of like hierarchy, which is kind of a bad word, and I understand that, but when you grow and you're at a certain size, it's really important to have things like sign-off processes or really clear descriptions of roles and responsibilities. The last thing that you need when you're trying to put out a really cool trailer for your new season is like an art director fighting with a level designer because they both think that they have ownership over the tone of something in the trailer. Like, it's about emotional management as well as the kind of resource management that you need. And that way everybody feels like they get to own a certain part, nobody feels micromanaged, like, and people can weigh in and feel confident where they're weighing in at those different points of the process. So these are all really important bits to keep checked. And one of my favorite examples too, in regards to the like, make sure nobody is the singular knowledge holder, is that happened very early on for us in Fall Guys, because we had Oliver as our community manager, and he was singularly doing like everything on our social media. And he was doing such a great job, but obviously like 2 months after launch, he was like, I need a holiday. Please, for the love of God, let me take a break. And obviously we wanted to do that, but at the same time, he was the only person at that point, because of how busy we were, that knew how to do all the things that he was doing. So we actually came up with an idea to create a character called Beanbot that was essentially like an artificial intelligence character that took over for Oliver while he was on holiday. And it created a whole new storyline and lore for our community, which was amazing. They fell in love with Beanbot as a character so much that we ended up having to make a character costume for him to go in game, because people just adored him and were very sad when Oliver came back from his holiday. So there's plenty of ways around that, but basically share as much as you can with your teammates. Make sure that nobody is acting either as a bottleneck or just like is being harmed because they're the only person who knows all of how to do something and occasionally need to, take a holiday. And then a bonus slide of the 5th point, which is the Holy Grail, which is you can only ever choose 2. I don't care what level you're at, what size your studio is, it's only ever going to be, one of these 2, good, fast, or cheap, especially as things amp up. That's particularly on the marketing standpoint too, when you have to deal with like agencies and outsourcing and trying to figure out how to get all the assets you need on time. So this is your little warning to ponder any questions you may want to ask. But in summary, these are kind of my tips for as your game and your marketing grows. Does it align with your values, whether it's the game value or the value of your studio? Will it match player expectations, and is there anything you should prepare ahead of time if it doesn't? Will it scale? Can you do something small that's going to have a big impact? Is there a process that could make your life easier? And are you trying to achieve the unachievable? don't try to do all three things at once. We're all human and we have limits. Then I thought this almost makes an acronym, but it's like the worst acronym ever. So don't refer to this as VESPA, but like I just had to add it anyways. So that is me. I hope this was helpful to just spark some things that might be pertinent as your career grows, and happy to take any questions. Yep. Processes would be my answer to that instead. Oh yeah. Oh, that's going to be now more hard. How dare you, Dan? When things scale, a lot of the times people say to not add too many people, and instead, what can you do on the marketing front in the same vein? Sorry, that was a terrible reiteration, but hopefully it's enough. And yes, you definitely don't want to suddenly inundate teams with people growth size and things like that. So that's when that kind of like process and system management is really helpful. If there's things that you can cut down or distill and then automate, or just make sure that everybody has the same ability to fulfill those processes across the team so that it's not bottlenecked to one person, that is hugely helpful. Or from a marketing standpoint, there's no need to always, for example, like scale up full time, but you might be able to bring on a temporary resource, whether that's a contractor for, like, some people bring on like a community manager for around the launch period, but then their contract ends, a few months afterwards when it's a bit slower, or agency help and things like that too is also an option. So that way you don't have to, be stuck with a giant team all of a sudden, but you still can get some of those extra resources when you need them. Cool.
Got a question? You've obviously seen that whole spectrum from agency to indie to large. From maybe drawing on like the indie experience, do you think there were some skills or traits that you picked up there that were valuable as things scaled up and got more corporate?
Yeah, and I think they apply across the board, whether you're a developer or doing marketing, and that's things like resilience and adaptability. One of the funniest things I've ever seen is when we used to keep trying to get a producer to join our marketing team, but were being given a dev producer who was trying to do things as it happens on the dev side, but marketing always kind of works with an agency mindset, and the pace is a lot faster and doesn't go to 2-week sprints. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to have this adaptability mindset and be able to change entire marketing plans, let alone assets and copy and all that kind of stuff on a dime. So anything to do with being able to be agile and react quickly to things is super helpful. And also I think just the ability to work well with others, like all those soft skills that we talk about in game development, are also hugely important, because most of your job is, as a marketer or being on the publishing side, is being a connective tissue between development, between agencies, and between the players. I think there's one in the back first. Yeah.
Just going back to the very beginning slide where you introduced a new company or a new product, you mentioned having values. How would you, as a marketer, decide what is a good value and what's a bad value to have for that set game idea?
Yeah, so how do you find your values for your game? First, I would be chatting or looking to the creator of the game, so whether it's like the designer or the person who came up with the idea, and trying to distill what you want people to feel when they play that game, and if there's any kind of like core principles about the mechanics themselves or like the game loop. And work from that to basically be like, okay, so we know we are these things. We know we are not these things. Like, we're never going to be a giant Metroidvania or something like that. So like, what are the things we are and we are not? And then align your values or core principles to that, so that you know where you stand compared to your competitors, what makes you unique, anything that stands out. We call them USPs, unique selling points, are really helpful to create your values. but it's also a very connective emotional part too. So trying to mesh both the mechanics of the game and the emotions you want players to feel.
Very much.
Cool. Yep.
Hi. So in answering someone else's question, you talked about processes as the place to go when you're kind of low on resource. What would be a good place to look in order to look at how other people have kind of implemented process? What kind of process they implement, like some learning resources possibly?
This is going to be the most boring answer, but I was asked where to go to look for process knowledge, which is a great question. It's just the answer is boring, in the sense that any kind of like project management resources are super helpful, and then you can bend them to what and how you and your team work, because a lot of them, similar to what I was talking about in regards to when we had a game producer come onto the marketing side, if you had a regular project manager come to try to work in games, they're also going to struggle because they're used to having things very regimented, and that's just never going to work. So try to take the essence from any kind of like Prince 2 or any type of other project management scenarios, and then bend it to what is going to work for you and your team. And also check out what other studios are doing too, and just having a chat with people has helped us a lot as we grew on Fall Guys to see where people were too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What's the MMS, like minimum marketing strategy, in your opinion, for an indie? Minimum steps you should do for marketing?
So what are the minimum steps to marketing as an indie? I would refer you to my first slide. Did you make a good game? Does it work? And do people know about it? And obviously the marketing part is more of that final question, but I suppose adding on to that, do the right people know about it? So knowing who are the type of people that are going to play your game and really enjoy it and engage it, and then basically become like a Criminal Minds person and research their behaviors, where they get their news, how they interact on social media, and try to blend that and your game. As we heard in earlier talks, like authenticity is really important. You don't want to be something you're not. So try to just hone in on who is your audience, how do they like to be talked to, and then show them all the best bits of your game in a way that feels good for your team.
Well, yeah, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Hayley. Round of applause.